Why are girls more successful in school, even though teachers favor boys? I started wondering about this because I had heard both facts as true. I had heard both that girls are more successful in school, and I had heard the fact that teachers favor boys. These two things to me didn't make any sense. I assumed that whoever teachers favored more was probably going to be the gender that did better in school. So I set out to investigate why this would be true. First, I'm going to quickly run through some data showing that teachers do, in fact, generally favor boys in school. Then I'm going to look at some of the data that shows that girls succeed anyway, and then we'll talk about why. First, let's establish that teachers do generally favor boys. Of course, this is not every teacher every time, this isn't every classroom every time, and it's not every boy every time. But in general, teachers do seem to favor boys. When researchers observe classrooms, very often what they'll do is they'll get a teacher's permission to sit in the back of the classroom and watch everything that happens in that classroom. What researchers find almost universally across the globe, in virtually every country, in most classrooms across the globe, is that teachers initiate interaction with boys a lot more often than they initiate interaction with girls. Around the world, and certainly in the United States, teachers call on boys more often, help them with their work more often, tutor them more often, answer their questions more often, etc. This pattern has been found in all levels of schooling, whether you're starting from preschool through elementary school, junior high, and high school. This pattern has been found. Teachers tend to favor boys. For example, a study of preschool teachers found that when preschool-age boys are physically aggressive, for example, hitting another student, pushing them, taking their stuff, preschool teachers are much more likely to say, oh, those boys, they need to be taught how to manage their aggression. So I'm going to spend some extra time with him, helping him understand that this isn't okay and how to manage his aggression in a different way. In contrast, when preschool age girls behave in exactly the same behaviors, hitting, pushing, taking stuff from other kids, the teachers will most often say, that girl should have known better. She should have already known how to not be aggressive, so I'm just going to punish her. Preschool teachers are much more lenient about preschool age boys' aggressive behavior. Now, I do want to point out that they aren't necessarily more lenient about all boys' bad behavior versus girls' bad behavior, just the physically aggressive behavior. That's what this study was focused on. And then as you go on past preschool into elementary school, junior high, and high school, generally the teachers aren't so much being lenient about bad behavior as they are just interacting a lot more with boys than they are with girls in the classroom. Teachers are much more likely to call on boys than they are to call on girls. They're a lot more likely to interact with boys' conceptions. So, for example, if a boy says, I think that Shakespeare meant such and such when he wrote blah, 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 the teacher is much more likely to actually interact with that idea and say, you know what, that's right, or no, that's wrong, or you might think that, but, or whatever. Whereas with girls, teachers were a lot less likely to even acknowledge what the girl had said, and when they did acknowledge it, to not really address it, but just say, and then go on. So some researchers ask the question, could it be that girls interact in class less often? For example, when the teacher asks a question of everyone in the class, that girls are less likely to answer than boys. So over time, teachers learn that the boys are more interactive in class and then start calling on them more. But the answer to this question was no. They were able to count the number of times that boys and girls in class responded when a teacher asked a question of the entire class, like, does anyone know, whatever, fill in the blank here. Girls and boys actually responded in equal amounts. So there's no evidence that girls are somehow like naturally more shy or naturally quieter and teachers are just responding to that. Instead, what seems to be happening is teachers are actually favoring boys more. Interestingly, boys are more likely to perceive their teacher as unsupportive, which is strange because researchers can count up the number of interactions and see that teachers are actually giving the boys more feedback and interacting with them more. But it may be because of this twist on the data. It turns out that even though teachers are much more likely to interact with boys in the classroom, more of that interaction is negative than it is with girls. Teacher interaction with boys happens more often, but it's more likely to be negative, like correcting their behavior or correcting their thinking when they've gotten an answer wrong. Teachers generally correct boys' behavior more quickly and more harshly, with the exception of preschool teachers not being willing to correct boys' physical aggressiveness. Teachers talk to girls a lot less often in the classroom, but when they do talk to girls, it tends to be more positive. And this is true even when the girl's personality is disruptive, oppositional, difficult. Teachers still respond more positively to girls. So my original question was, why do girls succeed even though boys are favored in the classroom? But it turns out that the part of that sentence that says boys are favored in the classroom isn't completely the whole picture. Is it really accurate to say that boys are favored in the classroom? It is true that teachers spend a lot more time on boys, but since a lot of that time is negative, maybe it's not accurate to say that boys are favored in the classroom. So that leads me to my next big part of this question, which is, why do girls succeed? With this knowledge that boys get a lot more of teachers' time and attention, but that time and attention tends to be negative, could that explain why girls succeed at school so much more? Maybe it's not about the amount of time teachers spend as much as it is the quality of that interaction. Maybe girls are being encouraged and supported in school while boys are being treated so negatively that boys just don't want to succeed in school. So then I started looking up information about girls succeeding in school. It turns out these two things aren't related at all. There is no evidence that boys or girls succeed or fail in school because they get more or less teacher interaction, or their interactions with teachers are positive or negative or anything like that. That is not what's actually happening. Instead, girls succeed educationally because they have to. Women make a rational choice that education is basically an insurance policy against poverty, and so they pursue education no matter what barriers might stand in their way. How are girls more successful than boys? Well, lots of ways. Girls generally have higher grades. They generally have higher test scores, of course, depending on the test. You can find some tests that might be an exception to this general trend, but generally girls have higher scores. Girls are more likely to graduate high school than boys are. Girls are more likely to enroll in college than boys are. Girls are more likely to graduate college than boys are. Girls are more likely to enroll in graduate school as well. With just about every measure of educational success you can come up with, girls do better than boys in kindergarten through 12th grade, and women do better than men in college. Researchers like to focus a lot on college graduation rates, specifically because that impacts someone for the rest of their lives. Your success in life depends very heavily on whether or not you've gotten a college degree. So By extension, researchers focus on that quite a bit. So let's look at some of the statistics over time and the trends over time in the United States. From about 1900 to about 1930, the ratio of men to women in undergraduate college was almost equal. In the 1930s, men started enrolling in college faster than women, so colleges started disproportionately having more men in them, and that trend really accelerated after World War II when so many of the GIs were coming home and they had the benefit of the GI Bill that was helping them pay for college. By 1947, the gender imbalance in college was at its absolute peak, the most extreme since 1900. There were 2.3 men in college for every 1 woman in college. By 1960, the gender imbalance was still pronounced. You would still go on a college campus and notice way more men than women, but it was starting to get better. Women were starting to enroll in college at higher rates. In 1960, there were 1.6 men for every 1 woman graduating from a 4-year college. In the late 1960s and 1970s, that's when women's behavior really started changing. Women began assuming that they were going to participate in the labor force, and because of this assumption, they took more math and science classes in high school. They chose college majors that were more similar to the majors that men had traditionally chosen. Women started marrying and having children later, and they started becoming more attached to their careers. It was in the 1980s that women and men achieved parity in college. That means that women and men enrolled in college at about the same rate, about the same percentages. And notice that in the 1980s, everyone was going to college a lot more. Everyone, men and women, their rates of going to college were 6 times higher than the rates had been in the 1920s. So in the 1980s, that's when men and women were enrolled in about equal numbers in colleges, but because women were increasing their enrollment steadily and men weren't, pretty soon women started outpacing men in college. By 2003, there were 1.35 women for every 1 man who graduated from a 4-year college. Another way to say the same thing is to look at percentages. In 1970, 58% of all college students were men. By 2000, 56% of all college students were women. So there's been a pretty big shift, especially since right after World War II, when men were very heavily favored to go to college over women, and now women are favored to go to college over men. Now let's ask the next part of this question. Why? Why did this shift happen? I've already kind of given you the answer in a very short form, which is that women feel as though they have to go to college. But let's look at the details here. Graduating high school, going to college, and getting a degree is an investment. You're taking time out of the workforce to go to college where you aren't earning money, and college is pretty expensive for most people, so it's an investment. You're spending money and denying yourself the opportunity to work during those hours that you're in college. You're losing money by going to college, but for most people, that investment is worth it. College pays off because you get paid so much more down the road if you have a college degree than if you don't have a college degree. This is called the education premium. In the early 1980s, workers with a college degree earned 50% more than workers without a college degree. But by the early 2000s, workers with a degree earned 90% more than workers without a degree. So you can see college is becoming more and more and more valuable for everyone. But education researchers point out that college has become even more valuable for women than it has for men. For example, Among white full-time workers in the early 2000s, the education premium for men was 70%. The education premium for women was 120%. That's just one way to break the data down, but you can easily see that college is valuable for everyone, but it's so much more valuable for women than it is for men. So when women go to college at higher rates than men do, women are behaving completely rationally. Now, I will note that what I'm telling you here is what I found in most research papers. The vast majority of researchers claimed that college just pays off for women way more than it pays off for men. But I did find one research paper. This one is from Becker, Hubbard, and Murphy, 2010. And they argued that if you slice the data in a certain way, you can show that college doesn't actually pay off for women that much more than it pays off for men. Instead, they argue that the costs of going to college are lower for women than the costs for men. They say that women's grades are higher, they do better in various measures of achievement, they do better in test scores, and they have fewer behavioral problems. So their argument is that college is just easier for women than it is for men. Whether you're agreeing with this theory, that it's really about the cost of college being lower for women, or whether you're agreeing with the theory that says that the benefits are better for women, either way, researchers are noting that women make a cost-benefit calculation about whether college is worth it or not. And if you're looking at the cost or you're looking at the benefits, college pays off more for women than it does for men. Many of the researchers I read also noted that education is an insurance policy against poverty. Now, a lot of people, whether they're men or women, view education as an insurance policy. They say, I'm going to college because I don't want to be poor later on in life. I want to have an easier time finding a good job. So education functions this way for everyone, but these researchers point out that it's especially important for women. Since the 1950s, the inequality between the percentage of women who are in poverty versus the percentage of men who are in poverty has grown. For example, among white people in the United States, in the 1950s, women were 10% more likely to live in poverty than men were. Slightly more, but it wasn't dramatic. But by 1980, women were 50% more likely to live in poverty. This is called the feminization of poverty. As poverty becomes more and more and more an issue that women grapple with, and men don't grapple with it as often, poverty is said to be feminized. This is because women are much more likely than men to be single parents. Among never married mothers, only about 1/5 received child support in the year 2000. So when women are single parents, they very often do not receive child support. Education can be kind of like an insurance policy against poverty. Women feel they can fall back on their degree even if they divorce, even if he refuses to pay child support. But more educated women are less likely to get divorced in the first place. It turns out that education is a pretty reliable insurance against divorce. And it's not because of women's education. It turns out it's men's education that matters. Well-educated women are more likely to marry well-educated men, since people are likely to marry others who are a lot like them. And well-educated men are less likely to get divorced. So education can be seen as marriage insurance as well. But how can researchers be sure about this? How can researchers feel pretty sure that women are outperforming men in education because they have to, because they feel like they're in a precarious position, because they feel like they need insurance against poverty? Well, we know this because of global data. This pattern of having a lot more women in college than men in college doesn't only exist in the United States. It exists in lots of other rich, industrialized countries. And in poorer, less industrialized countries, men still tend to go to college more often than women. Women outperform men in school and specifically going to college in places where, one, education pays off more for women than it does for men, and two, women are otherwise disadvantaged. For example, I was able to find some research out of Germany that discussed how the education gender gap is most pronounced with disadvantaged families, families with many children, families with single-parent households, families with fathers who have low occupational status, so they're working crappy jobs, and Catholic households, which are disadvantaged in Germany. The pattern that this research found was that girls who grow up in disadvantaged households must be making decisions about graduating high school and going to college differently than the boys who grow up in disadvantaged households. However, if you look at richer households, upper class households, boys and girls make much more similar decisions. So overall, this picture is that somehow being poor, being disadvantaged, being lower class is pushing girls, but not boys, into college. This totally tracks with the idea that more girls going to college than boys is because girls are trying to hedge against poverty. Girls are trying to have kind of like an insurance policy against future poverty. Let's summarize. Teachers generally favor boys in the classroom by spending more time with them, calling on them more, interrupting them less, etc. But on the flip side, they also have a lot more negative interactions with boys, like correcting their behavior and their thinking. However, teacher interactions seem to have nothing to do with whether boys or girls are more likely to succeed or fail in the education system. Women are more likely than men to succeed in education because they feel they have to, because they feel education is an insurance policy against divorce and against poverty. While a college degree can increase a man's paycheck a lot, a college degree increases a woman's paycheck even more. Degrees are simply more crucial for women's success than they are for men's success.